On today's episode, I'm joined by Jim Fries, Chief Executive Officer at Rx360, where he leads the international pharmaceutical supply chain consortium with a mission to protect patient safety by improving the integrity of the supply chain and the quality of materials. Rx360 is a real force for good and thought leadership in our industry, so I'm delighted that Jim can speak to us today. The PharmaSource Podcast is sponsored by Olon. Olon Group is a global leader in the development and production of active pharmaceutical ingredients for CDMO and generic markets, integrating chemical synthesis and biological processes while always embracing the highest international safety, quality and environmental standards. With one of the longest track records in the API industry, they have deep development expertise and a broad set of advanced technologies, making them the partner of choice for clients' molecules to enter the market successfully. Olon has a global network of 11 manufacturing sites and 7 R&D centres across the globe. Thanks to 2,300 employees, including 300 highly experienced and qualified R&D experts, Olon represent a highly innovative and reliable partner. Hi Jim. It's always pretty early on the East Coast whenever you respond to emails and do calls. Do you always wake up so early?
I do. For me, it's just kind of a way of life, but it comes with the territory. We're an international consortium, so we work with people around the world, and we have to respect their time zones a little bit too, right?
Well, I appreciate it anyway. So Rx360, talk to me about how it was founded, because I think everyone knows that it dates back to the worldwide recall of Heparin back in 2008, which was a tragic incident when the drug became contaminated in China and resulted in 81 deaths in the US and left many more injured. So could you tell us about the impact of that event on the industry and how did it go to forming Rx360?
It's a great story how Rx360 started. Really, it started on the back of a negative. And the Heparin incident, like you described, really was a negative, not only for the industry, but really for patients. And how as a pharma industry do we get together and combat that? And people like Martin Van Triest, who at the time was at Amgen, as well as other, real good pharma thought leaders around the world in the area of quality, and supply chain, got together and said, how do we stop this? How do we not have another aha moment when we realize we're so vulnerable? They got together with the FDA, Janet Woodcock at the time, and really the idea of a consortium, a members-only confidential consortium, came out of this meeting. They all got together in Washington, D.C., and that's how Rx360 was born. It was born on the back of a members-only consortium that really shared ideas on integrity of supply chain, patient safety, material quality, those things that really share best practices in order to kind of mitigate or even stop kind of the bad guys from winning. And let's face it, when we deal with our pharma supply chain, there are bad guys that we're always trying to stay one step ahead, and keeping that quality of materials, really at an optimum level, because ultimately that's what takes care of the patients on the back end.
Mm. How big an issue is it, Jim, for counterfeit drugs in the supply chain? Are there any examples you could share?
There's one big example I'll share here in a minute, but I want to start with addressing the first part of your thought there, which was, how big of an issue is it? Is it still an issue? That type of thing. And what I tell people all the time is it only takes one incident to have it be a really bad issue again. It's not, there's no difference between 20 little issues and one big one. And so we have to pay attention to that. And recently, over the last couple of years, there was one that really sticks out in my brain that, anybody can Google and go take a look at it. But it really was the big counterfeiting case with Gilead and their HIV drug. And the way that law enforcement, the way that the legal experts in conjunction with Gilead worked to not only uncover but take down a massive counterfeiting ring that not only was affecting patients but was, financially putting the pharma industry behind the eight ball, really was a case study in in how to not only identify counterfeit drugs, but also how to combat and stop the utility of those drugs. I mean, I point to people like Jeffrey Potter, who is one of the lead investigators and legal minds in this area. And Jeffrey did a heck of a job on the Gilead case, and should get a lot of credit, as well as all the people at Gilead and law enforcement around the world that worked on it. But that probably is the number one case where I can say, hey, not only did we identify a problem, and when I say we, I mean the industry. Not only was the problem identified, it was researched, and it was found to an end game where we found the people responsible. We stopped it dead in its tracks, and really set a precedent moving forward that maybe scares the next person before they decide to do something like that and really affect and hurt patients.
What have been the main milestones over the last decade and a half that Rx360's been around? Where would you see that the consortium's made the most difference in terms of developing standards?
Thank you. I don't get asked that question a lot. So it's something that I think really has been kind of that upward cascade of events for the consortium. And you can go back to when we started. I mean, the original members of Rx360 started what would be, kind of a staircase of nice accomplishments. So whether it was getting together, 15 years ago and opening up and deciding to start the consortium and having our first working group wrapped around supply chain security that really still exists today. And some of the great minds in that arena in pharmaceutical supply chain security get together once a month at Rx360 and talk about, for lack of a better term, what's going on in the industry and sharing best practices. And to me, that's one milestone, is the idea and the model of getting people together in a confidential manner and sharing best practices, sharing together what really makes a difference and how we can help each other. I have to be honest, it was a little bit of a growing moment for me when I took over as CEO of Rx360 about 5.5 years ago, to sit in a room and watch 10 pharma companies sit around a table. And all of them, at some level are competitors. Yet here they are in a confidential manner, talking openly about, hey, here's how we tackle this. Hey, how do you do that? They're benchmarking against each other. They're sharing ideas, all in the name of patient safety. That's very powerful. So to me, that's one milestone. The other milestone came a few years later that really has been refined over the course of the last 4 years, and that's our joint audit program. And in my mind, the ability to partner these manufacturers in the industry to confidentially sponsor audits of a supplier in their space really not only helps mitigate the audit burden on the manufacturer side, but it also helps reduce the burden of audits on the supplier or auditee side, because they can then use that audit report to work with other manufacturers through Rx360 and maybe reduce the calendar burden and even the financial burden of hosting audits. So the joint audit program has grown immensely. I mean, we've trademarked joint audit program. We've grown it to the point where I think it's really truly is the foundational and best joint program in the world. I like to talk to people in terms of, I think we wrote the book on how to do it. And I really believe that we have a great team internally that at Rx360 that works with our members in the industry every day on the program. So those are two milestones that I think are foundational to Rx360. There's been some other ones. I mean, through our members, we've worked with the FDA and others to help support the Apex Supply Chain Security Toolkit. That's been huge. We've published over 100 papers that are member generated. We've developed, in upwards of 10 and 11 audit checklists now that we use that are totally member developed. So it truly is a testament to the hard work of our members. This definitely is not a, hey, Jim Fries sitting in his office coming up with ideas. It truly is our members that really, take the step forward to do these things. And what's always amazed me is, if you take 10 people walking down the street, right, and you talk to them and 9 out of 10 of those people, I think because of the way that we are in the world today, might have a negative opinion on the pharmaceutical industry for a variety of reasons, right? But I think what they don't understand is all of the hard work that goes on behind the scenes in the pharma industry in order to keep them, the patients, safe. And I think as a pharma industry, I think being able to talk about that a lot more is a wonderful opportunity to share some of those things that are going on behind the scenes to keep patients safe. It's one of the eye-opening things that I have enjoyed over the last 5.5 years of watching the emotional investment that people in the pharmaceutical industry have towards patient safety. It's a wonderful thing to see.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because it's one of those things which you just sort of thankfully assume that the drugs are going to be safe. Would it be possible just to sort of give at a high level view, what are those threats which come into the supply chain? Who are these bad actors? Why do they do it? How do they do it?
Yeah, and I think it can be done in a number of different ways. I mean, we talked a little bit about counterfeiting before, and listen, there's probably a big for the bad guys. There's a big financial gain when you talk about counterfeiting drugs, right? So there's a piece of the puzzle. Another piece of the puzzle, and listen, we've seen it where it's an accident. When we've seen it, maybe in the Heparin incident, where it's been done on purpose, where a supply chain line is contaminated and results in a bad batch of some type of material that ends up in a medicine. I mean, that you can read about those type of things all the time. And the best way to combat that, and that's one of the things that I love about Rx360, is the idea of sharing best practices on how to, be diligent and keep your eyes wide open, but also the amount of time, energy, and money that pharmaceutical companies spend on quality initiatives on their end is just immense. And again, I think a lot of people don't understand that. A lot of people walking around on the street don't understand that. Is the amount of audits that they do at suppliers, the amount of things that they look at are just massive and immense. And it's by continuing to do those audits, it really keeps ultimately us safe. And really also from a supplier end, I think those suppliers have gotten much, much better over the years of quality initiatives too. What are they doing internally to make sure their facilities are safe, that their manufacturing lines are optimized? So I think that it really is a collaboration between manufacturers and suppliers working together, and maybe it is through this audit process that allows them to stay on top of, quote, bad things happening. I think one of the challenges we had in the industry was, it was, again, in the spirit of having those moments or aha moments, is, when the pandemic hit, all of a sudden, literally in a 24-hour period, we went from doing on-site audits to wondering, how in the world are we going to audit our suppliers? It's not like the manufacturing of drugs stopped during the pandemic. It continued to move forward, but how do we optimize and maintain that quality during the pandemic when we can't go on site to do an audit of a facility? And to watch the industry rally and kind of integrate and crank up remote audit programs through the use of different technologies was really, really exciting to watch, and to watch it happen so quickly to maintain the safety of those drugs throughout the pandemic was really a testament to the industry as a whole.
Jim, the way you talk about it makes it sound like it's very easy to bring together all of these pharma companies and to find alignment between them. But I'm sure that isn't always the case. And when there are divergences of opinion, how do you tend to manage that?
Yeah, it's again, I'll go back to the comment I made earlier in our conversation here. It was really a learning for me to sit in a room and have all of these pharma companies that at some level are competitors sharing ideas. Like it didn't equate in my head. But to your question or your point about how do you manage differing of opinion, and there's one common theme that I think ultimately comes out at the end on why people can collaborate in a consortium manner to come up with a best practice. And it's because ultimately everybody in that room is, if they're aligned around patient safety and if they're aligned around the patient and what's best for the patient, then you're always going to come to an agreement. If you maybe had a mindset that was agenda driven in differing opinions or differing areas, it would be hard to come to that meeting of the minds. But when you look at the idea of, and that's the wonderful thing about Rx360 as a nonprofit, our mission statement is based around supply chain integrity, material quality, and patient safety. And when you sit down in a room as a member of Rx360 in a confidential manner and have those three things as your foundational principles, it becomes much easier to always come to alignment. If you didn't have those three principles, particularly the one around patient safety, I would say that, yes, it would probably be difficult to come to a meeting of the minds, but ultimately sharing best practices because of those three principles is what drives the day. I love the fact telling people that in the 15 years that Rx360 has been around, the mission statement hasn't wavered. And I think it's one of the strong points that we have. Members that come into the consortium, they understand that, we're a nonprofit, we have a mission that we live by, and they buy into that. And if they didn't buy into that, Rx360 would not exist.
You've spoken about how the supply chain security toolkit, which was developed in collaboration with APEC and the FDA, how that's one of the most underused resources in the industry. Could you just give us a quick overview of what it is and why it's so important, please?
Yeah, I'm going to say it's underutilized, and that's just my own personal opinion. I think it's probably one of the most wonderful tools that people can use to get guidance on how to play in the supply chain security world when it comes to pharmaceutical products. And the work that the FDA in conjunction with APEC has done in regards to this toolkit is second to none. And being able to have that toolkit now housed under U.S. Pharma, I think will allow for more people to access it. Rx360 has played a tremendous role, not only updating it over the past few years, but being involved at the very beginning. People like Tony Zook at Merck and Reggie Jackson at Pfizer were really involved in the early days as well as ongoing. And it's something that Rx360 really kind of looks to from a standpoint of, you asked me earlier about milestones. I think this was one of the ones that we were really involved in that you can point to that says, hey, this is an impact that Rx360 has had in the industry. And kudos to the FDA, kudos to USP and everybody involved in APEC. I know they recently had a little mini conference in Washington, D.C. to kind of kick off a lot of this kind of reinvestment in the toolkit. And it's really a step-by-step guide. It's a tremendous tool, not only for big pharma and organizations that have been around for a while, but even for new startup pharma companies, that are getting ready maybe to, come out of clinical trials, become a commercial product. These type of tools that are out there in the industry really, really can help them in the early days. And, that's one of the things that I have found with Rx360 is the resources that we offer are very advantageous to the not only the large pharma companies, but the smaller pharma biotech companies that maybe don't have the resources for all of these different quality initiatives and supply chain integrity initiatives. We're here to help them. And the APEC toolkit, again, like you had mentioned, is one of those tools that I think we've been involved in the past that's made a difference.
Coming up in September, you're going to be hosting an expert workshop with PharmaSource, so thank you for that, about how sourcing and procurement teams can make sure that they're sourcing their products from reputable suppliers and digging in some of those best practices around how to conduct their own due diligence to verify the authenticity of suppliers, and also how to work with their peers in quality and assurance. I wonder if you could just give us a bit of a flavour of the kind of best practices, the kind of advice that you'd give for people in sourcing and procurement who potentially have come in from different lines of business where they haven't had to deal with something quite as serious as this before?
Yeah, I think it's listen, we could probably go on for the next hour talking about all the little nuances that people have to look out for. But to me, it really comes down to making sure that the root or the foundation of whatever quality component that you're, or quality initiative that you're strapping yourself to, whether being in procurement or that type of thing, make sure that the supplier that you're working with, you check all of those quality boxes. Make sure that if you're looking at an audit report from that supplier, that it's recent, that it comes from a root source where it wasn't passed along from one auditor to another, make sure that the audit checklist that was used fits your needs. Really kind of dive into, if you are, getting an audit report from a supplier, number one is get all the background on what's included in that audit report, including, again, the timing of it. And then if you are conducting audits, make sure you're working with an audit partner. If you're not doing them yourself, make sure you're working with an audit partner that has a background in what you're trying to accomplish. And from a pure procurement side, if you're a procurement person at a pharma company, make sure that you have open lines of communication with your quality department. Those two departments, I think work hand in hand and really have to have open lines of communication. They can actually help each other. So again, I think that's the two things that I would say from a procurement person is have open lines of communication with your quality folks, and then also really make sure that if you are initiating quality initiatives to select a supplier, to work with a supplier, make sure all those boxes are checked when it comes to picking that supplier from a quality perspective.
Have you ever seen cases where quality comes into conflict with other objectives such as cost containment, speed to market, and innovation? And if so, what advice would you have on how to do both?
I mean, you always hear about that, right? And I think we'd be a little bit naive if we looked at each other and we said that didn't exist, right? Internally at organizations, it's always going to exist. But to me, it's a simple mindset to get over any humps in communication around those things. And it's what we talked about earlier when you asked me about Rx360 members getting together and maybe not coming to a standard of ideas when they're sitting in a room together. How do they share ideas, that type of thing. And it all came down to one thing, right? What's good for the patient. So I think even internally, in organizations, if there's a difference of opinions on things when it comes to maybe quality butting head with procurement or commercial activities or whatever it might be like that, is just remember it's about the patient. And if we can keep that in mind, I think any hurdle can easily be overcome. But when you start thinking about other things are more important than the patient, that's where you're going to run into challenges.
That's a great final thought, I think, Jim. Thanks so much for your time here today.
Oh, my pleasure. It was wonderful. And if there's anything I can do or answer for any of your listeners, just feel free to reach out to me.
As mentioned earlier, Jim Fries will be chairing an online workshop for us on the topic of supplier integrity best practices. It's going to be an interactive deep dive into how procurement can partner with security and quality. It should be a really valuable session. So head to pharmasource.global/events and reserve your place. Thank you to Jim, and a special thank you to Olon, who sponsored this episode. You can find out more about their CDMO services on their website. Head to olonspar.com for more information.